So I'm Alison. I work for MSDS Marine, and we are the UK project managers for the Rooswijk 1740 project. I'm going to start off talking to you today, and then I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Angela, who's the lead conservator for the project and who is based at Historic England. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Martijn Manders and the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands, RCE, for both letting us give the presentation today, but also for all the work that they have enabled on the site over the last few years. So to start with, I thought it'd be helpful to tell you a little bit about the Rooswijk and the ship itself. So the Rooswijk was built in 1737 for the Chamber of Amsterdam of the Dutch East India Company. The vessel itself was 145 foot long, it weighed 850 tons and was armed with 26 guns. During its lifetime, it completed one return voyage to Batavia during 1738 and 1739, and it was on its outward journey yet again to Batavia when it got caught up in a huge storm on the Goodwin Sands just off Kent in the coast of England and sank in January of 1740. The ship itself was lost with all hands, over 300 people, as well as taking down to the bottom of the sea its cargo of trade goods and silver. And there it remained on the seabed for many years until Ken Welling got involved. Now, Ken is a local diver and researcher who undertook extensive documentary research and magnetometer surveys during the late 90s, trying to locate the wreck. He found his targets and he went down and did some diving and revealed two sites with evidence of heavy cargo, guns and anchors, but very little in the way of actual ship structure. It wasn't until the sands shifted in 2004 that more ship structure was revealed, and he knew that he had found the Rooswijk. A salvage operation to recover the silver was then led by Rex Cowan, and this was ultimately stopped in 2007 when the site was protected under the Protection of Wrecks Act. The site was then monitored by Historic England using their contractor Wessex Archaeology, but very little physical work actually took place on the site until our project began. And that happened around 2015. Now, as I mentioned already, the site is owned by the Dutch government. It is managed for them by the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands, RCE, and managed in England by Historic England on behalf of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So it was really appropriate that any investigations had to have the heritage agencies of both England and the Netherlands involved in this investigation of a Dutch wreck in British waters. After all, wrecks such as the Rooswijk are part of the shared cultural maritime heritage across Europe, and it's important that cultural heritage agencies are able to work together to ensure that sites such as these are protected, researched, understood and appreciated by all. So in 2015, colleagues from RCE approached Historic England about undertaking a joint project on the site. And together, RCE and HE developed a project design that led to 10 days of diving on the site, as well as geophysical survey. It was a mixed team of divers and archaeologists from both RCE, HE, MSDS Marine, as well as the original excavation team and involving the licensee and the owner of the wreck's cargo as well. So it was a lot of people that came together to make this happen in 2016. Now, the wreck was already classed as high risk on Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register before this work, mainly due to the exposed remains and vulnerability of the site on the seabed. And everything we saw in 2016 really confirmed this. The high value of goods on the seabed also meant the site was incredibly vulnerable to illegal diving. And this was confirmed on the site in 2016 when the survey boat had to physically position itself over the site to keep a boat that looked like it was preparing to dive the site illegally off. So it's a challenging site in many ways. Now, the Goodwin Sands, where the site's located, are extremely mobile, and that's great for archaeologists as it's the sands covering the wrecks that preserve them. However, with a heritage management hat on, it's quite bad when they move and start to reveal that archaeology because you have to be able to put systems in place to react quickly. And the multi-beam undertaken in 2016 revealed changing sand levels and showed the Rooswijk was increasingly being exposed, which meant material was being lost by the mechanical action of the tide, but also by other environmental factors such as gribble and teredo. And so we knew we had to act. So in response to the threat, the 2017 and 2018 diving project was developed. The aim was for an international team to come together to excavate, record and assess an area of the at-risk remains of the Rooswijk and to contribute to an enhanced understanding of the wreck and establish a way forward for its future management. In particular, we wanted to contribute to a better understanding of the wreck and site formation processes, including the ship's design and the state of preservation. A project design was produced and all parties signed up to that, and all licenses, including those from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and the Marine Management Organisation, were secured. What followed next was a huge excavation project over 2 field seasons. Over 376 surface supplies dives took place from our diving support vessel, which was stationed out above the site for long periods. The vessel was moored on a 4-point mooring system, and excavation took place using surface-powered airlifts. Divers were tracked using Sonardyne's Scout system, and the position and data information of artefacts was recorded using 3H's site recorder software. In terms of the actual diving, the site's in 20 metres of water, and the hat cam footage on this slide shows how dark it can actually be. Visibility ranges from near 0 to 3 metres. 3 metres is very rare and you're exceptionally lucky. It's a dynamic environment with waves of sand that travel from north to the south of the site. In the 2 years on site, we had over 2,000 finds, including coins, cannonballs, galley items, granite blocks, chests, personal items and ship's fittings. There were sections of coherent structure on the seabed, as you can see from this site plan, although they were largely disarticulated. And we made the decision that only diagnostic structure would be recovered and the rest would be recorded and left in situ on the seabed. Now, as well as the main diving project, the project worked with volunteer scuba divers in 2 ways. The first way was to hold 3 site open days, kind of like you would for a terrestrial excavation, where we invited divers to come and dive on the site and see what our archaeologists were doing. So very much like your traditional site open day. The second way was to run a sub-project to the main excavation and to work alongside volunteer divers to investigate an outlying anomaly that had been picked up on the geophysics. The LAS were invited along to run a scuba support project from a separate vessel, and the team was a mix of professional archaeologists and volunteers, and their work showed there was an area of wreckage, including iron guns, that was outside of the then protected area. This enabled Historic England to recommend to DCMS that they extend the designated area to ensure the outlying areas were protected, and really volunteers in this instance were able to add real value to the project. So as I've mentioned, all these finds were recovered. They were brought ashore to a shoreside facility in Ramsgate for recording and first aid conservation before ultimately being transferred to the lab at Historic England. The base acted as a secure location and was really important as it was easily accessed by both the public and the press. The archaeological information that can be gained from the wreck is a unique resource, and shipwrecks are time capsules that offer a unique glimpse into the past and tell a story. Telling that story to a wide audience and engaging the public was very important to the Rooswijk 1740 project. From the outset, we saw community engagement as crucial, and to date, over 1,600 visitors have attended open days either in Ramsgate, Derby or Portsmouth. We've had a large social media presence throughout the project on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, and those accounts continue to share updates. We've put out a huge amount of blog posts. We've had temporary signage in Ramsgate itself. We've hosted educational visits at the warehouse, including one to 50 homeschooled children and their parents. One of my particular favourite aspects of the project has been virtual access through 3D modelling of artefacts for immediate presentation of online using Sketchfab. So people didn't have to wait to the publication to see the material found. It was immediately made available. We used the base to host several press visits and we've had a lot of media interest. The project itself has been a maritime archaeological project on a scale seldom seen in England in recent years, and as such, that brought a lot of attention to Ramsgate itself. This resulted in two different types of impact relating to Ramsgate and its Heritage Action Zone. The first was directly measurable in terms of the financial contribution to Ramsgate's economy, and that can be measured in terms of actual spend in Ramsgate during the course of the project. So our calculations from 2017 alone show that in that first year, over £50,000 was directly spent in Ramsgate by the project, people visiting the project, and also team members on their own time whilst based there. The second element is much harder to measure directly, and that's the impact that the high-profile project and its associated media coverage has had on the area. The project even hosted a visit by the Dutch Minister for Culture and the head of RCE. High-profile visits such as this, combined with the press coverage, really were a boost for Ramsgate and the Heritage Action Zone. A key component of the project was capacity building and training. We all know there are so few practical opportunities for students and early career maritime archaeologists to get hands-on excavation experience, and we really, as a project team, wanted to address that. We've provided opportunities for over 21 student placements of at least 2 weeks, as well as 3 much longer internships. And training has been given to those students by both the project archaeologists and conservators at all stages of the project. We've also developed NAS courses which have been run to enable members of the project to gain skills in maritime archaeology. To date, over 170 people have been on an NAS course run through the Rooswijk project, which I think is a staggering number, really. At the end of the 2018 diving season, though, we closed down the Ramsgate facility as it was only ever planned to be temporary, and all the material was delivered to Historic England at Fort Cumberland, and that is where Angela takes over the rest of the story.
So, as Alison just mentioned, after each excavation season, the artifacts were transferred to Portsmouth, where the Historic England Conservation and Research facilities are located. Here, a multidisciplinary team works on the artifacts, and I will give you an overview of the work that has happened to date in what we call the post-excavation phase. During the Rooswijk excavation, a huge amount of artifacts were recovered, and moving this large find assemblage is not an easy task. We had to consider the different materials and call in help to shift, lift, and move artifacts. Operations on this scale need to be carefully planned and organized. An underwater excavation on the wreck site can very quickly result in a huge material archive, and the Rooswijk was no different. As Alison mentioned earlier, the team has allocated over 2,000 find tags, but the actual artifact count is much larger. Each artifact was labeled using a pre-printed label, which was really useful and avoided double numbering and numbering out of sequence. On this slide, you can see a mix of individual artifacts and large chests containing a multitude of artifacts. So the individual recoveries are clear, they were given one number, but the larger chests and containers were also just given one number, but do actually contain hundreds and hundreds of artifacts, such as can be seen on the pictures to the bottom of your slide here, where you can see inside a cask containing hundreds, possibly even thousands of nails. At the bottom left, a chest with thimbles, and the picture on the bottom right is a wooden chest containing saber blades. One of the first things we did after the artifacts arrived at Fort Cumberland was to X-ray the many concretions and other mainly metal artifacts. These X-rays create an essential record of the condition of the artifact, but they are also instrumental in identifying and quantifying objects. As soon as artifacts were recovered, they were placed in fresh water, and this happened at the Ramsgate warehouse facility that Alison mentioned earlier. This preserves them and stops uncontrolled drying out of artifacts, but it also starts the very lengthy process of desalination. Once back in the lab at Fort Cumberland, we carry on with desalination, now using distilled water wherever we can. We also have to make artifacts available to other researchers, so there is a lot of grappling in tanks and moving boxes going on. When we then move on to the active part of conservation, we use a variety of tools to remove concretion and corrosion layers to micro-excavate objects. Removing these layers will help speed up the desalination process and at the same time reveal artifact surfaces, tool marks, maker's marks, decorations, and so on. Now, let's look at one concretion in more detail to illustrate how we work. A concretion forms around a corroding iron object. Iron is very unstable and its corrosion products are much larger in volume than the original artifact. And often corrosion continues until there's nothing left of the actual artifact. And we can see that as dark voids on the X-rays, which have the shape of the original artifact. Here in this case, a number of nails, as illustrated on the image on your right. But when a concretion forms, a whole load of other materials such as surrounding sediment, stones, shells, and other artifacts also get incorporated into the corrosion products and form a really hard mass called concretion. Now, how do we work on these? First of all, we use the X-rays to guide us. And our favorite tool is probably the air scribe. This is a pneumatic tool where the tip vibrates and removes the overlying concretion. This can be very messy and very noisy, but can also achieve really, really good results. And the example you see here is one of the probably the largest concretions that were recovered from the site. It measured 2 by 1 meters and mainly contains iron shot, so cannonballs and bar shot, but also iron chain, crowbars, and remains of a dead eye and other smaller artifacts. And this large concretion was worked on site in the Ramsgate warehouse facility, which then allowed us to move the individual artifacts to Portsmouth rather than having to transport this very large concretion. Now let's go back to the concretion that we looked at earlier. So you can see it here being worked on. And on the bottom left image, you can see the nail voids that I described earlier. They're fully exposed now, and it's clearly visible that nothing of the actual nail is left. The images at the top show some of the glass and copper alloy beads and copper alloy ring that were micro-excavated from the concretions. The yellow and white specks inside the concretion are yet more glass beads that need to be removed. This work is really quite tricky, and we often swap over to another tool, the ultrasonic scaler, at this point, because it allows us to work on a much smaller scale. Artifacts or ecofacts, such as animal bone or plant remains removed from concretions, then get passed on to the relevant specialist and enter the conservation treatment schedule. But it's not just the conservators who are making interesting discoveries and starting to unlock the secrets of the Rooswijk and its many artifacts. Here we have, for example, a concretion containing mainly bar shot, and amongst the iron shot we uncovered the neck of a glass bottle which still had the cork inside it. Now, to find the cork inside the bottle is interesting enough, but when we started to clean it, we realized there was a white residue present on the cork, but also around the top of the glass neck. And this is where it's good to slow down and take a pause. It is very easy to get carried away and clean away the evidence. Our material scientist, Francesca, analyzed a tiny sample of the white residue, and it turned out to be colophony, a resin that was applied to the cork and the neck of the glass bottle to achieve a good watertight seal. And it's these small discoveries that are not only interesting for us, they tell us something about the logistics and preparation for long sea journeys, and they indicate what raw materials people had access to. Generally speaking, in material science, we try to answer some basic questions. What is it? How was it made? And where was it made? My colleagues Sarah and Francesca are using a variety of analytical equipment to sample artifacts and materials, but not all techniques are destructive. The method of choice really depends on the question being asked. Because glass can be processed in conservation more quickly than other materials, especially the metals, for example, quite a bit of work has taken place on the various glass artifacts already, such as the bottles, drinking vessels, or glass beads. And once we are able to return to the labs, we will continue work on the other materials as well. Our archaeobotanist, Ruth Pelling, is identifying plant remains. These can tell us something about the provision on board, but also the living conditions. Alison mentioned earlier that the Rooswijk is a very dynamic site with shifting sandbanks. and sample taking from sites such as the Rooswijk can be really quite challenging. Sediment samples from the site itself so far have mainly reflected the seabed sediment composition, but we had more success with sampling the content of containers such as this saltware jack. These have yielded edible plant remains such as grains of wheat, cereal bran, flax, mustard, hemp, and a single broad bean. But Ruth has also been able to identify plant remains that were possibly used for packaging and padding of the cargo goods that the Rooswijk was carrying. And she's identified buckwheat chaff, cut grass, or hay, and sphagnum moss. These plants would have been used in the same way we are using sawdust or polystyrene chips today. We're currently puzzled by 5 coconuts that were recovered from the site. There was an important market in coconut shells in Northern Europe during the 15th to 18th century when they were carved into drinking goblets. However, we know of a later nearby wreck that spilled a cargo of coconuts in 1889, and we're currently undertaking C14 dating to resolve this mystery. Excavations on the Rooswijk have yielded a small assemblage of animal bones, including fragments of cattle, aurochs, sheep, pig, large mammal, and fish. And my colleague Polydora Baker is working on these animal bones. 5 of the 6 pig bones recovered came from one concretion and are part of the lower hind leg. The artifacts from the concretion are consistent in the date with the wreck, and the anatomical coherence of the bones suggests that the pig leg is contemporary with the wreck and that it lay relatively undisturbed as the concretion formed. The bones may derive from a live animal that was carried for provision on board the ship, or could have come from a preserved meat joint. A fossilized large bovid astragalus, the ankle bone, is probably of Pleistocene date. The size and morphological features are consistent with aurochs, the now extinct and much larger wild relative of modern domestic cattle. Bones of Pleistocene animals, including other large bovids, for example the buffalo, may be washed out of land deposits or derived from animals which died on what used to be dry land. As we continue with the conservation and analysis of the different objects, we will reveal maker's marks, decoration, such as can be seen on the pewter jug or the trumpet here. We will continue work on the chests to find out about their content. We will be able to quantify the recoveries, which will give us a better understanding of the scale of trade that was going on in the 18th century between the VOC and the East Indies. We will continue with material analysis to research the composition of the various materials and might even be able to say where certain raw materials came from. So although diving has stopped, discoveries are still being made. And we are still providing training opportunities as part of the Rooswijk project. We have a number of volunteers that help us on the project. We have hosted a couple of student placements and have also run a number of NAS courses. And as I just mentioned, the diving work itself has stopped, but you can still explore the Rooswijk virtually by visiting the dive trail, where you get guided through the full excavation, the archaeological processes from discovery to conservation and analysis. Ultimately, artifacts will return to the Netherlands. Plans are currently being made for a project publication and exhibition to share the results of this international project with interested parties and the wider public. Do stay in touch via our various social media channels. And now it is my pleasure to introduce next week's speaker. It will be Gary Momber from the Maritime Archaeology Trust, who will talk to us on sea level rise, climate change, and separation of the UK from Europe 8,000 years ago. Thank you.